Primitive, problematic, persistent. A preliminary overview of humanity's first 200 years in the GC, from the book Margins of Order, A Cultural History of Humanity in the Galactic Confederation, by Archivist Emeritus Veg Terol, Department of Nonconforming Civilizational Studies, University of Centralis Prime. The most enduring myth about the humans is that they joined the Galactic Confederation. This is not entirely accurate. They arrived, they were evaluated, and then, somewhat reluctantly, somewhat out of curiosity, and entirely due to procedural deadlock, they were permitted to stay. At first, it was unclear whether humans should be contacted, monitored, or politely ignored. Ultimately, all three approaches failed. The earliest GC orbital surveys of their homeworld, Sol 3, designated Earth in Terran parlance, were not promising. The planetary biosphere was chaotic. Atmospheric carbon levels fluctuated due to industrial overuse and inconsistent mitigation policies. Political regions numbered in the hundreds, each with their own legal systems, currencies, and standardized power outlets. At the time of initial assessment, Earth had 22 simultaneous active regional conflicts, 17 distinct traffic control philosophies, and 3 competing definitions of the word football. The GC surveyors described the species Homo sapiens as socially erratic, technologically uneven, and frequently unaware of their own limitations. One early behavioral report, now declassified, included the line, "displays remarkable emotional range in interpersonal bonding, which is almost immediately undermined by resource hoarding or spontaneous violence." Another added, more pointedly, "may simply be bad at peace." The species was flagged for long-term observation under the Sapient Development Monitoring Treaty, subsection 14F, High-Noise Civilizations of Unknown Vector. The central concern was not that they would destroy themselves. Most GC observers assumed that was inevitable, but that they might do so loudly and in a direction inconvenient to someone else. GC Council debate on the matter spanned 3 annual sessions. Proposals included a non-contact quarantine sphere, selective genetic uplift, and, from one overzealous delegate from the Drelkar cluster, strategic hibernation of the species until it could be safely introduced into modern society. Ultimately, consensus was reached on the safest option: do nothing. Humanity, it was agreed, would likely burn out before achieving interstellar relevance. That assumption held for nearly 60 standard years, until the incident in the outer Sol system, what is now euphemistically referred to as First Contact. The GC research vessel Vashtali Restraint was conducting routine gravitational surveys beyond the heliopause when it intercepted a mining signal of irregular pattern and absurdly inefficient packet structure. Assuming it was a distress beacon from a malfunctioning GC-era drone, the crew tracked the signal to its origin. A Terran survey skiff with a mismatched hull, visible radiation scoring, and, according to one sensor technician, the smell of something that had once been lunch. The human crew made contact first, broadcasting a series of greetings that oscillated between cheerful, apologetic, and mildly threatening. A meeting was arranged aboard the GC vessel. The human delegation consisted of one civilian bureaucrat in an ill-fitting pressure suit, one retired fighter pilot, and an uncredentialed civilian named Gene, whose only apparent contribution was the production of a liquid compound called coffee. Diplomatic records show the first GC ambassador to sample the beverage collapsed from a combination of thermal shock and aggressive caffeine concentrations. The GC later classified coffee as both a stimulant and a cultural destabilizer. Nonetheless, a provisional trade agreement was signed the following day, partially, one suspects, to prevent further Terran hospitality. Initial GC classification of humanity listed them as an associate species, non-voting, granting them limited presence within the GC structure without diplomatic influence or fleet command access. The designation was chosen not out of hostility, but out of caution. Internal GC memos from the time described humans as socioculturally inconsistent, diplomatically informal, chronically underprepared but enthusiastic. Their application to full member status was delayed pending a 3-decade probationary period. In the meantime, they were granted access to limited sector integration and placed into roles considered too low impact to generate consequences. These included Satellite maintenance, particularly in orbital regions where AI platforms had gone obsolete. Cargo routing, where unpredictable human navigation sometimes produced faster, if unrepeatable, results. Planetary surveys in low-priority sectors, often resulting in useful data paired with extensive commentary about the weather. Cultural liaison assignments, primarily in volatile GC outer systems where no other species volunteered. During this time, human vessels were frequently the least maintained, least standardized, and most oddly named in their class. Ship registries from this era include such entries as Unscheduled Regret, Mostly Functional, Steve, and the still unexplained I Told You So. When questioned, human captains often cited tradition, a bet, or we were just in a mood. Despite initial misgivings, reports began to emerge, quietly at first, of Terran adaptability in unexpected scenarios. Their habit of repurposing equipment, bypassing protocol, and ignoring hierarchical deadlock led to measurable improvements in areas typically resistant to GC process efficiency. A notable example involved a satellite repair team that solved a persistent orbital resonance issue not by recalibrating the stabilizers, but by tilting the entire station 3 degrees to the left using an anchored tug and sheer stubbornness. GC engineers declared the solution non-standard. The problem did not recur. This early phase of human GC integration would come to be known informally as the tolerance window, a period during which humanity's presence was officially tolerated, unofficially avoided, and increasingly relied upon in fringe sectors. They were not understood, they were not fully trusted, but they were slowly becoming necessary. Of course, at the time, few saw it that way. To most within the GC ranks, particularly in mid-level administrative departments, humanity remained a curiosity, a background noise, a temporary oddity that would either evolve or exit. But the humans had no intention of leaving, and as later chapters will illustrate, they had a talent for staying, sometimes quietly, sometimes explosively, in exactly the places no one expected them to thrive. They didn't just integrate, they seeped in. Within one generation, a pattern began to emerge. When protocols failed, humans succeeded. Not elegantly, not reliably, but undeniably. In the wake of malfunctions, natural disasters, unexpected debris fields, and bureaucratic paralysis, human crews would be found, disheveled, often unlicensed, using tools not rated for purpose, somehow restoring function and salvaging outcomes that more advanced GC systems had abandoned as unsalvageable. One of the earliest documented cases involved a failed orbital relay in the Maris Reach. Official GC engineering teams had logged the relay as structurally compromised, slated for decommissioning, citing component decay and system desync. A passing Terran freight vessel, unsupervised and hours off course, docked with the relay without formal clearance. When the next scheduled inspection arrived a week later, the relay was broadcasting at 112% baseline capacity, modified to self-balance power fluctuations using refrigerator coils, 3 pressure valves, and what appeared to be an Earth artifact known as a toaster. The incident report was heavily redacted, though an internal note attached to the file reads, "Not approved. Works anyway." This pattern repeated often enough that the GC issued an official clarification in the Auxiliary Field Operations Manual under the section Terran Contingency Handling. The first 2 entries read, "If the human says, 'Trust me,' assess local exit vectors. Expect outcomes, not consistency." The manual's tone is not mocking, it is quietly alarmed. The so-called wrench war provides a more vivid example. During a planetary standoff in a neutral border sector, a GC diplomatic team found itself under siege in a modular embassy facility with failing shields and no functional weapon systems. The only defense was a maintenance team of 3 Terrans, armed with standard-issue tools, 2 mag clamps, and a hydraulic bulkhead stabilizer. Over a 3-hour engagement, they turned the stabilizer into a mobile shield platform, used gravity clamps to create a kill zone, and flanked the attackers via ventilation shafts. When GC security forces arrived, they found a still-smoking field, 15 disarmed hostiles, and 1 human covered in coolant fluid, eating from a ration pouch labeled extra spicy. The attackers later claimed they had been defeated by a mechanic. This was in fact true. Such moments began to alter how humans were perceived, particularly outside the GC's administrative core. While official evaluations remained cautious, field officers increasingly requested Terran technicians for complex environments. When asked why, one sector coordinator replied, "Because they don't wait for permission to fix the mess." A more mythic incident emerged in the form of the first Warthog, an old mining vessel retrofitted by a human crew to serve as a forward anti-pirate platform. The hull was non-standard. The systems were outdated. The weapons were creatively bolted on, according to Fleet Command. But the vessel achieved 12 successful interdictions in 3 months, using nothing more than superior targeting instincts, a makeshift railgun derived from mining equipment, and a sensor array jury-rigged from outdated research drones. The pirates fled. The GC promoted the humans. The ship's name, Dirty Snout, was quietly retired from fleet registry, and Warthog class was added to an informal list of Terran tactical assets. This adaptability became most visible in early encounters with the Eshar. Humans were frequently deployed to outer patrols, not as a strategic decision, but because no one else wanted the assignment. It was presumed they would provide a deterrent at best, or a distraction at worst. What followed was less predictable. The first confirmed human-led destruction of an Eshar cruiser was filed as coincidental tactical success during irregular patrol movement. When it happened again, twice, the pattern became harder to dismiss. Analysis showed that human captains deviated from GC combat doctrine not because they misunderstood it, but because they ignored it. They utilized unpredictable maneuvers, set traps using salvaged heat flares, and once reportedly launched a crate of engine parts toward an Eshar hull at sublight speeds to test stress points. Eshar intelligence eventually labeled humanity as chaos operational outliers. Their own military models failed to simulate human behavior in wargames. The few that tried had to disable predictive filters and account for what Eshar analysts termed reckless invention under pressure. As GC Command debated these developments, another phenomenon took root within the civilian population: cultural integration, not through policy, through preference. GC stations began requesting Terran coffee processors, despite multiple advisory warnings from medical boards. Condiment imports from Earth, particularly various hot sauces, skyrocketed. One popular product, Molten Despair, extra tangy, was banned on 3 aquatic worlds for internal evaporation hazard. Linguistic shifts followed. Phrases once dismissed as crude became part of common GC slang. Field officers began to use Terran idioms in briefings. Winging it used to describe improvisational maneuvers. No plan survives contact, now cited in 3 strategy syllabi. Fix it until it breaks, paradoxically adopted by maintenance teams as a motivational slogan. Perhaps most surprisingly, Terran war stories, frequently exaggerated, often sung, began to circulate among GC personnel as morale-boosting folklore. One popular tune, The Ballad of Duct Tape Dan, tells of a human engineer who sealed a hull breach with emergency blankets, epoxy, and something from his pocket he refused to identify. The song ends with the ship surviving re-entry. Historical accuracy is doubtful. Popularity is not. By the end of their first century in the Confederation, humans had not risen to prominence, nor had they aligned with GC expectations, but they had embedded themselves in systems, in tactics, and in language. They weren't fully understood. They weren't fully explainable. But they worked. They didn't just integrate. They seeped in. By the beginning of their 2nd century in the Galactic Confederation, humanity had transitioned from a curiosity to a complication. They had proven adaptable, yes, but also viral in the cultural sense. They propagated ideas, habits, and idioms faster than even the most cautious GC sociologists had projected. What began as an experiment in fringe inclusion became a case study in cultural absorption. For better or worse, humans were no longer passengers in the GC. They were participants, occasionally disruptive, frequently innovative, rarely predictable. It was academia that folded first. Several major universities, originally under pressure to track and contain Terran social influence, opened formal Terran studies programs. These were intended at first to be cultural oddities, electives for underachievers and diplomatic tourists. Within 4 decades, The curriculum was expanded, standardized, and eventually mandated as part of strategic operations coursework. GC military colleges now require passing scores in asymmetrical thought vectors, Terran case studies, for officer promotion beyond level 4. One widely circulated dissertation, Terran Improvisational Logic and the Ethics of Necessary Insanity, received cross-species commendation and is still cited in modern risk doctrine. Even language shifted. Once human phrases were adopted, translated, transliterated, and woven into operational vocabulary. A standard after-action report might now include lines like initial approach failed, fallback to wing it protocol, or engaged hull breach solution pattern, duct tape contingency. These were not metaphorical. In one case, on record C-197 beta, the duct tape contingency involved literal use of Terran adhesive to patch a compromised coolant conduit mid-battle. The fix held long enough to complete evacuation. The crew survived. The solution is now taught as part of a broader module called Technically Unacceptable, Functionally Heroic. Simultaneously, changes began filtering through GC military infrastructure. Terran units were officially still treated as part of the broader Confederation forces. Unofficially, however, certain command divisions, especially Strategic Denial Command, J-16, began to reassign human personnel into what were euphemistically called off-script roles. Gray zone operations, influence disruptions, nonlinear response initiatives. These units were small, lightly equipped, and generally untraceable. They also had an unusual success rate. There is no formal acknowledgement that J-16 began specifically recruiting human skiff crews, logistics runners, and technical salvage teams as irregular assets. There is, however, a substantial uptick in post-mission reports where phrases like Terran vector interference, situation resolved via cultural asymmetry, and unexpected Terran engagement caused target withdrawal appear without further elaboration. GC tactical simulations soon encountered a problem. Enemy modeling systems could not consistently predict human action. Escher war game software failed to account for non-standard behavior under pressure, largely because human units routinely made choices that were either irrational or strategically brilliant, or disturbingly both. One internal GC memo summarizes it plainly. They don't follow doctrine because they don't really believe in it, a high compliment in retrospect. The Escher, once dismissive of human participation in the GC, shifted from contempt to wariness following the events of the Polarnus III retaliation campaign. The original Escher strike on Polarnus III, a major agricultural hub for Terran colonies, was both unexpected and devastating. GC response was delayed. The humans predictably did not wait. What followed was not a formal operation. It wasn't even sanctioned. Yet over the course of 14 months, Escher supply routes began collapsing. Scout ships vanished. Communications hubs suffered cascading failures caused by environmental irregularities. Local Escher officers reported sabotage, misinformation, and psychological warfare involving sound transmissions and misleading sensor echoes that mimicked their own ships. No conventional GC fleet participated. No medals were awarded. But the food shortages across 3 Escher provinces speak for themselves. Intelligence analysts still argue over how such a campaign was conducted with no official approval and minimal equipment. No one argues about who did it. Then came Project Gutterlamp. The GC's best minds had failed to solve a rising issue with cloaked Escher scout ships penetrating outer sector defense zones. Existing detection arrays were ineffective. Fleet Command was preparing to deploy multi-billion credit gravitic distorters when a group of Terran engineers from a weather station in the Dry Rim cluster presented a solution involving off-grid agricultural sensors, vibration loops, and a whole lot of junk foil. It worked. The detection net caught 3 cloaked vessels in its first sweep. Fleet Command did not comment publicly. The weather station received a fruit basket and a signed directive quietly upgrading their operations license to Tier 3A. Cultural bleed-through into civilian populations was even more potent. Terran stories, particularly those involving survival, trickery, or impossible odds, spread through GC entertainment channels at rates normally reserved for religious phenomena. Children on 12 different homeworlds now play a game called Skiff Crew, involving a group of underqualified misfits fixing an interstellar crisis using only a kettle, a wrench, and the power of improvisation. Initially banned in 6 systems, it has since returned as a cultural education tool under the revised title Crisis Resilience and Human Systems Theory, Interactive. Toy manufacturers, recognizing demand, began selling Terran-style adventure kits, featuring improvised tools, rations, and communicator decals that say, "I've got a terrible plan, and it just might work." By the time the GC Ethics Council attempted to regulate these kits, 2 of their own grandchildren were already wearing mini Warthog Commander helmets to school. The vote was postponed indefinitely. Even public discourse fractured around the topic. GC citizens could be heard in transit terminals or cafeteria queues arguing, often passionately, about whether humanity was dangerous, brilliant, or both. One popular opinion column began, "I do not like them, I do not trust them, and I hope they live forever." To suggest that humanity fully assimilated into the GC would be untrue. They didn't adapt to the system. They worked around it. Their systems were not always stable. Their methods not always safe. Their ideas were unregulated. Their ships were loud. Their food was aggressively seasoned, and their history bordered on improbable. But they endured. They made themselves part of the structure, not by fitting into it, but by bending it until their shape left an imprint. They weren't built for this alliance, but they've found every crack in the walls and turned them into doors. The GC made room. The Ashar learned fear. And the humans? Well, they just kept showing up. If you enjoy my stories set in the GC universe, you can now buy Tales from the GC Volume 1 in Kindle and paperback format off Amazon. It would mean the world to me if I sold a few copies, or even if you just flick through 1 or 2 of the stories on your Kindle Unlimited subscription. The links can be found in the description below. Thank you. The next GC story will be out soon.